When the corridors of international diplomacy converge at the United Nations, the stakes are never trivial. Every statement, every pause, every carefully chosen word can ripple across continents, unsettling alliances and recalibrating power balances. Into this tense environment walked Ibrahim Traore, Africa's youngest leader and the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso. Known for his uncompromising stance on African sovereignty and independence from neo-colonial structures, Traore had already made himself a controversial figure in the eyes of many Western powers. What unfolded in New York when the United Nations allegedly forced him into a situation where an apology was expected became one of the most unforgettable moments in recent memory. Not because of submission, but because of defiance. His response shocked the Assembly, stirred the conscience of nations, and amplified Africa's voice in a way that has not been heard in decades. The backdrop to this extraordinary moment lies in a string of policy shifts and alliances forged under Traore's leadership. Since assuming power, his government has broken away from traditional Western partnerships, restructured relations with France, questioned the dominance of the CFA franc, and embraced new alliances with Russia, China, and regional African neighbors. These decisions angered powerful actors who viewed Burkina Faso as a pawn to be managed within Africa's geopolitical chessboard. When Traore dared to accuse Western institutions of exploiting Africa under the guise of aid, it triggered diplomatic backlash. His presence at the United Nations was supposed to be an opportunity for him to soften his tone, repair frayed ties, and, in the words of one diplomat, reintegrate into the international family. What the world got instead was something radically different. The session was tense even before Traore took the podium. Reports had circulated that the UN Secretary-General and certain Western envoys had requested him to offer an apology for his sharp criticisms of international organizations. They had anticipated a young leader overwhelmed by global pressure, perhaps intimidated by the grandeur of the Assembly Hall and the weight of global expectation. Instead, Traore's composure, his firm tone, and his commanding posture instantly signaled that he had not come to bow. As cameras flashed and delegates leaned forward, he began by acknowledging the Assembly with courtesy, but it was not long before his words cut through the carefully manufactured atmosphere of diplomacy. In his speech, Traore made it abundantly clear that he was not there to apologize for defending his people. He questioned the very notion of being asked to apologize. How can it be a crime to speak truth to power? How can it be an offense to demand dignity for my people? His words were both sharp and poetic, piercing through the diplomatic silence of the room. Instead of retracting his earlier criticisms, he amplified them. He accused global institutions of hypocrisy, of preaching equality while practicing domination, of speaking of human rights while turning a blind eye to the rights of Africans exploited for minerals, resources, and cheap labor. This was not an apology. It was a counterattack. The reaction in the hall was as dramatic as his speech. Some Western diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to colleagues, visibly uneasy at the tone of defiance. Others, particularly delegations from African nations, Latin America, and even parts of Asia, erupted in discreet applause, nodding in agreement. What shocked the Assembly was not merely the rejection of apology, but the unapologetic reminder that Africa is no longer voiceless in global affairs. Traore declared that Africa has been patient for too long, waiting for reform, waiting for justice, waiting for recognition, only to be continually deceived. His statement that Africa will not wait any longer echoed like thunder across the chamber. This moment was deeply symbolic. For decades, African leaders at the UN have often spoken with restraint, careful not to upset Western allies, aware of the consequences that could follow bold defiance. But Traore's youth, his revolutionary rise, and his refusal to inherit the old playbook made him distinct. He represented a generational shift, one where Africa's leaders are less concerned with appeasing global powers and more determined to assert independence. His response signaled not only his personal defiance, but also the collective frustration of an entire continent. To fully grasp the significance of Traore's refusal to apologize, one must understand the historical weight of the United Nations for Africa. Since independence movements swept across the continent in the mid-20th century, the UN has often been a stage where African grievances were voiced, but rarely addressed. Issues of colonial exploitation, resource theft, and unequal trade terms have been raised repeatedly, but resolutions have often been watered down or ignored under pressure from global powers. For African leaders, the UN has too often been an arena where they were expected to perform gratitude rather than demand justice. Traore broke that expectation entirely. The diplomatic aftermath was immediate. Western media outlets described his speech as confrontational, provocative, and uncompromising. Some accused him of undermining diplomacy. Others, however, recognized the honesty and authenticity of his message. Across African media platforms, his response was celebrated as a historic moment, a long overdue declaration of independence in the global political sphere. Social media across the continent buzzed with clips of his speech, hailed as a courageous act of defiance. For many young Africans, it was not just a speech, it was a vindication of their frustrations with a system that has long denied them equity. The economic and political implications of this defiance are profound. By refusing to apologize, Traore risked straining Burkina Faso's relationship with Western donors, financial institutions, and aid agencies. Yet, at the same time, his stance elevated his stature among African citizens and leaders who see independence and sovereignty as worth the cost of aid dependency. It also opened doors for deeper cooperation with non-Western allies who applauded his defiance of Western pressure. Nations like Russia, China, and Turkey saw in Traore's defiance an opportunity to strengthen ties with a leader who was unafraid of challenging Western dominance. His boldness, therefore, not only shocked the UN Assembly, but also recalibrated Burkina Faso's place on the international stage. What makes this episode even more fascinating is the contrast it revealed between global powers' expectations and Africa's reality. The UN Assembly expected contrition. They received confrontation. They anticipated submission. They witnessed sovereignty. The ripple effects of that moment are still being felt. By breaking with diplomatic convention, Traore sparked conversations far beyond Burkina Faso about the role of young African leaders in reshaping the continent's global narrative. His defiance has become a case study in the shifting balance of global power, one where Africa is no longer content to play the silent observer. As days passed after the speech, reactions continued to unfold. African youth movements embraced his words as a rallying cry for a new era of independence. Political commentators noted that his refusal to apologize was not just a rejection of Western pressure, but also a warning to future generations of African leaders not to bend to foreign dictates. In the West, however, policymakers grappled with the question of how to engage with leaders like Traore, who are unwilling to play by old rules. Would they attempt to isolate him? Or would they recognize that his voice represents not just himself, but an entire continent in transition? Perhaps the most striking element of Traore's response is the moral clarity with which he spoke. He reminded the Assembly that African nations are not children to be scolded, but sovereign nations with dignity. He pointed out that Africa's resources have enriched the world while its people remained impoverished, and that any demand for apology should come not from Africa, but from those who profited from its suffering. His words flipped the narrative entirely, placing the burden of accountability on those who had demanded it from him. This rhetorical reversal left the Assembly stunned, for it exposed the double standards at the heart of international diplomacy. In essence, the moment when the UN forced Traore to apologize, and he instead stunned the world with defiance, will be remembered as a turning point in the politics of African sovereignty. It was more than just a speech. It was a symbolic rupture with the past. For Africa, it was a declaration that the era of quiet submission is over. For the world, it was a wake-up call that the balance of power is shifting, and that leaders like Ibrahim Traore are no longer playing the old game of diplomacy by Western rules. What lies ahead for Burkina Faso and for Africa is uncertain. But what is undeniable is that Traore's response has carved out a legacy. He is no longer just a young revolutionary from a landlocked nation. He has become the voice of a continent demanding respect. His words at the United Nations will echo in classrooms, in protests, in policy debates, and in the hearts of Africans for years to come. And whether the world accepts it or resists it, the message is clear. Africa will not apologize for demanding its freedom.